Okay, the committee will now resume, and I welcome a representative of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation to give evidence. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Mike Burgess, Director General Security.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. In this instance, the committee has asked that any opening statements be written and tabled rather than read out, and so we will proceed directly to questioning because the committee is certainly familiar with your submission. But by way of an opening question, Mr Burgess, can you set the scene for us a bit about what are the threats that ASIO is concerned about and what the committee should be thinking about?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Committee. And noting your comment on opening statement, I'll answer that question. I've got some words here that I will read in regards to, but I'll stick to the threat. So in doing that, it's important that I frame ASIO's purpose, which is to protect Australia and Australians from threats to security, and that includes threats from foreign interference and espionage. So most people have a good understanding of espionage. In plain language, it's when a foreign power or someone acting on behalf of a foreign power steals valuable information, either physically or by cyber means. The term foreign interference, which is a separate concept to espionage, is less well understood. Foreign interference is different from foreign influence. All foreign states take actions to influence deliberations of importance to them. That's a normal part of statecraft, and that is acceptable when those actions are taken in the open. Foreign interference is a much more nuanced concept. As defined in the ASIO Act, foreign interference includes clandestine or deceptive actions conducted on behalf of a foreign power that aims to affect political or government processes or otherwise is detrimental to Australia's interests. So if a person publicly voices their support for a foreign government or promotes even its controversial policies, that is not in itself foreign interference. However, if a person is secretly being directed by a foreign government, then it may well cross the threshold of foreign interference. And if those actions are secretly directed by a foreign government, are damaging to Australia's national interests, then ASIO has a role to play in protecting Australia and Australians from threats to security. Foreign interference is about covertly shaping decision-making to the advantage of another nation. If left unchecked, it is highly corrosive. So Australia is facing a heightened threat from foreign interference and espionage. ASIO is aware of attempts by foreign intelligence services to steal valuable information from Australia. They have done so using traditional methods such as recruiting human sources, as well as through cyber compromises. The committee would be familiar with the well-publicised cyber attack against the Australian National University in late 2018. ASIO has also identified foreign intelligence services and their proxies persistently seeking to develop relationships with Australian government political figures, academics, businesses in Australia and their representatives in pursuit of objectives detrimental to Australia's interests. And in some cases, foreign interference can be extended to threats of physical harm. Hostile foreign intelligence services have directly threatened and intimidated Australians in our country. Universities and research institutions are one such sector that is vulnerable to these kinds of activities, given that foreign governments are seeking information about Australia's capability, including our research and technology. So ASIO's view, in our view, it's important that sectors take national security risks seriously. That said, it is also clearly in the national interest to make sure that universities, publicly funded research agencies and competitive research grants agencies are able to get on with their core role, educating students and fostering innovative research. And therefore taking a sensible approach to national security risk shouldn't stop the sector from getting on with their core role. An example of that would be hosting foreign students in our universities is absolutely appropriate. It generates economic, social and academic benefit and is important for diversity of thought in our national institutions. The continued collaboration between Australian research institutions and their international counterparts is also important. Again, it's this kind of open collaboration involving applying the best and brightest minds from across the world to a problem is a key part of progressing research, innovation and critical thought that benefits our society more broadly. Addressing national security risks doesn't need to come at the expense of academic freedom, which forms a core pillar of our universities and research institutions. These are all important aspects of a healthy democracy, which values a free and open exchange of ideas and which prizes innovation. In my view, we also need to be cautious about overgeneralising the motivations of foreign intelligence services. For example, the existence of China's Thousand Talents program is, in of itself, not concerning. It's a natural extension of China's strategic plan to become a world leader in technology and to secure their economic and military advantage. China has been quite open about their ambitions in this space and how it serves their national interest. ASIO's focus is where a foreign government uses covert, clandestine and deceptive means to obtain Australian research. Foreign intelligence services and their proxies are all too willing to take advantage of the openness that is integral to our universities and research institutions to steal intellectual property and cutting-edge technologies. Again, it is the intent and character of the activity that matters. I note that discussions surrounding the inquiry are touched on wider matters of potential curbs of free speech and protest activity on campus. And as a matter of law, these are not things that ASIO is able to focus on. We do not investigate peaceful protests. We would be concerned, however, if a foreign government is active behind the scenes trying to covertly shut down free expression. This is when ASIO would and does take action. Finally, ASIO's role in countering these threats is clear. We will provide proactive advice to counter the threat and take action to disrupt the harm activity when we detect it, regardless of the sector. We engage regularly with the university sectors through the University Foreign Interference Task Force and through our outreach program. But it would be helpful and useful if there was greater clarity for what kinds of research and sensitive technology that needs protection. It would provide universities with greater certainty about the areas where they need to be cautious, including when engaging with foreign institutions. It would give publicly funded research agencies, universities and other institutions more surety when applying for research grants in sensitive areas. And it would mean that students and academics have a clear sense of how they can express their freedom without inadvertently undermining Australia's national interests. And of course, it also assists ASIO by enabling us to focus more closely on those activities that carry the potential for greatest harm. There are some challenges in defining what needs to be protected, particularly for dual-use technologies. But this is an area where Defence has existing experience in managing defence export controls that could be drawn on. That policy deals with similar challenges in that encouraging the export of sensitive defence and dual-use goods where it is consistent with national interests. Clarity is one thing, of course, but you also need the supporting policy and legal frameworks in place to enable Australia to protect our sensitive technologies and research that is important to Australia's national interest, without compromising the openness that is integral to this sector. Of course, even with more guidance, ASIO is not all-seeing and all-knowing. And again, that's a great part of living in a democracy and not a surveillance state. That's why being able to sensibly discuss the threats that we are facing with universities and research institutions is so important. That conversation needs to be informed by what foreign interference is and isn't. And that's why this is such a vulnerable opportunity of this inquiry, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr Burgess. That is very helpful in setting the scene for us. I'm glad that you mentioned in your in that comment the Australian National University cyber incident. I don't know how much of the previous hearing you might have caught or been briefed on, but it was a question I pursued with the Department of Home Affairs as well. Do you know who was behind the ANU hack? And if so, can you say who it is?
Chair, I do know who was behind it, but I would not say that publicly because I don't believe that's my role to do so.
Okay, thank you. Well, that gives me some comfort that you do know, and yeah, I hope it is noted that we know. Moving on to other matters, in your submission, you listed a number of quite troubling case studies, incidents that you're aware of coercion of academics and students. Could you expand a little bit upon those, obviously in a way that doesn't identify the academics or the institutions inappropriately, but how does ASIO become aware of things like this, and what are the sorts of things that ASIO can do to combat this?
Certainly, Chair. You're right, I would be constrained by giving you details, but in terms of general terms, the types of activities we're concerned about sit across espionage and foreign interference. So firstly, students who are engaged in research have access to sensitive or potentially sensitive information, and they can be a vector to acquire that. So the Foreign Intelligence Service could target institutions, their researchers, academics and the students to acquire that information. Of course, some foreign governments, and it's more than one, care about what their students get up to on campus. So just some awareness of what their students might be up to. And in some cases, they might use or want to use their students to counter certain things that are being said on campus as students go about their free speech, or universities and the curriculum they're teaching might be a problem for certain nation states. So the threat will come at the institution and the students through different ways, depending on what they're after: information, or to shape the environment so it doesn't do things that's counter to that nation's interest. And when I say that nation, I'm not talking just one nation. There are more than one nations engaged in espionage and foreign interference. We come about knowing about this because the universities themselves are able to call it out. Students can report it. There's mechanisms through National Security Hotline and other arrangements we have in place, and of course our own range of sources and methods that give us the ability to see and know and learn about what is happening in this sector as well as others.
You noted there, I think very appropriately, that it's not just one country that we should be concerned about, and I suspect the lessons that we'll draw out of this inquiry and the recommendations we'll make will serve us well in regard to our international engagement with all countries, but particularly those with authoritarian political systems that do have posed challenges to our open political system. Is the threat, though, overwhelmingly from one country in this space, or is it a more diverse threat and evenly distributed?
I would characterise it as more than one country. One country in particular is highly active, but they are not alone in that endeavour. So we don't just focus on one country, but one country might be at it more than others, but there are more that we turn our mind to and do come up against in this space.
And do you feel at liberty to say which country that is highly active that you're referring to?
So again, Chair, I don't believe it's my role. My organisation's role is to identify that threat and help reduce the harm from that. Public attribution of that is not for the Director-General of Security alone. There are many other factors that the government must take into account when they decide on how they deal with that particular problem.
Fair enough. Thinking about the different challenges that we're grappling with, there is, as you've correctly identified, issues around research and the integrity of research and intellectual property. There are issues around cyber security and safety, and then there's issues on kind of broader campus cultural issues like academic freedom and free speech. And you rightly pointed out that ASIO has a defined brief which will cover some but not all of that. I think the evidence has been really strong on the research issues and to a lesser extent, but almost equally on the cybersecurity issues. On the issues of kind of academic freedom and free speech for students, it has been raised in some submissions, but a lot of it is anecdotal and it's harder to pin down. And we'll be asking other witnesses about this as well. I will be asking other witnesses about this as well. What insights do you have in that third space, in that issue of student coercion, academic coercion, intimidation, threatening free and open debate on campus by state actors?
Certainly. If I may, Chair, your comment about what's in our remit and what's not, we focus on espionage and foreign interference, so across all three of those. So in particular on the students and their right to free speech and what they do on campus. So yes, we are aware of issues where people are claiming that's happening. Our focus, my organisation's focus, will be where a foreign government is actually directing students to interfere in that free speech. Of course, we have to recognise that universities, it's been a big thing in those institutions, and when we invite foreign students into our country and into our universities, they equally have a right to free speech.
Exactly.
So sometimes that tension you might see on campus is because you just have someone who is proudly of their country of origin and they don't like the other person's protest and they counter-protest, or they say things that maybe in the cold light of day they might regret, but that doesn't mean to say there's the hand of a foreign intelligence service directing that activity. So I acknowledge some of those things that people say. I'm sure they are true. What's behind it and whether or not it's foreign interference, as I would see it, is something we focus on. And I think you see a range of just the students being students and being proudly of their own country of origin, with, yes, there are a small number of cases that we're aware of where you might see people being encouraged to do that.
To make this a little bit more specific, a number of submissions to the committee have noted the activity and involvement of one particular organisation, the Chinese Students and Scholars Association, and its links, formal and informal, to Chinese diplomats here in Australia, including the Chinese Embassy here in Canberra. To what extent is that organisation, to what extent can you tell us if that organisation is on your radar and whether you are concerned with that kind of coordination of apparent student societies with foreign governments?
Sure. I obviously won't talk about who or who isn't on ASIO's radar. Again, I would focus on, and not to be unhelpful, Chair, if vehicles like that were used to covertly direct, then that has my full attention. Of course, I can also recognise that if that's happening, but it's happening kind of because that's a country promoting its view and they're engaging in that free speech, then that's not my focus. It's when that's done covertly and clandestinely or deceptively that where we will focus and recognise that is a serious issue and is a breach of Australian law.
Yeah. So putting that organisation aside then, do you believe that there are foreign governments who are working through student societies to advance their interests covertly?
I wouldn't want to answer that here in a public forum.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Well, I do have plenty more questions, but I know other colleagues do as well, so I want to share the call with them. Senator Keneally, you have the call.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to ASIO for their submission and to the Director General for his appearance today. If I can just stay on this point for a moment regarding protest activity on Australian campuses, and I ask this because some of the other submissions go to this point as well. I note that the distinction you make in your submission about whether that activity is being directed by a foreign state or not is what piques your interest as an agency. I note that on your submission, you also talk about things you're aware of. You're aware of researchers who've been threatened. You're aware of universities who've been threatened. You're aware of instances where academics have self-censored. You don't say you're aware of circumstances where foreign state actors have sought to coerce or prevent protests on campus. Are you able to answer that question? Is ASIO aware of that?
If we saw that, we would deal with it. Where we see that, we deal with it. But I won't say any more in a public hearing.
Okay.
So the key point is, Senator, when we identify it, we will deal with it to satisfy ourselves that actually that action is prejudicial to security and something that we can focus on, and then how we would handle that would depend on what we find, whether it's just an action of ASIO or it's something the Counter Foreign Interference Task Force is asked to look at to deal with the way they need to through to prosecution. So we'll apply our full means to it once we've investigated that to a certain level.
I appreciate that answer, and I appreciate you're limited in what you can say in a public forum, but I flagged, Chair, it might be useful for the committee in an in-camera hearing either today or at another point to probe this a bit further if we could, simply because it has been raised in other submissions, and it, given that ASIO has advised us of things they are aware of in their written submission, it struck me as something that might be useful for the committee to better understand.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Keneally. I agree. Let's have a discussion about that offline.
Okay, thank you. If I could also go, Director General, in your opening statement, you made a comment about, or an observation about, the one area that might assist universities is that where they have, if I'm paraphrasing you, that they would have better access to advice about where risk lies. That is essentially that, one of the things that we need to work on as a community is to be able to provide, advice to universities about where risk lies. One, have I understood you correctly? And two, when we're talking about risk, Are you thinking about technology? Are you thinking about areas of research? Are you thinking about advice about countries or individuals who might pose a risk in terms of partnerships?
Yes, Senator, I'm talking about technology or research that is actually sensitive to our national interest, and being very more clear about what is in that frame, what isn't. So therefore universities can make some informed decisions on who they involve in that and who they engage with on that. I think that would be very helpful for everyone, because you can have a conversation about where we are clearly saying that's a no, this is up for conversation, and by default everything else, please continue to be the great organisations you are, either in educating and pushing research forward.
It seems to me from the submissions, both from the university sector and from government, that is an area that many of the submissions would support, or that is the next logical step, perhaps, that many people are arguing for. We heard evidence earlier today from Home Affairs that there was such a project underway within government, I believe, that they called it Critical and Emerging Technology Policy, or Critical and Emerging Technology Group, being led by Prime Minister and Cabinet. Is ASIO involved in that work?
I'm aware of that work, we are involved in it, and yes, of course, because I'm sharing this view here and publicly, it's one I've shared with my fellow officials, and it's something that officials are working on to work out what that advice would look like.
Right. And part of our terms of reference is to look at other jurisdictions that in the world that might provide instructive examples. Are you aware of any jurisdictions we should be looking at where they have established a framework or a trusted forum for the sharing of information between government and universities?
I'm not aware of any, Senator, but then I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, although I would offer a view that I think Australia is generally ahead of the curve when it comes to identifying and managing this risk, and collectively we and our foreign partners are all working through how best to do that.
Well, that takes me to another question, and again, whether you are the correct person to ask it, but the extent to which there is opportunity for Australia to cooperate with our Five Eyes partners in particular on some of these challenges. You know, how much of the work that's been done in terms of UFIT and the guidelines and this critical and emerging technology policy, is this something we are doing, that we are drawing knowledge from our Five Eyes partners?
Yes, certainly, especially in my space, but more broadly in the space you're talking about, that collaboration. But that actually also goes beyond Five Eyes. It goes to all allies with aligned national interests. So that's something that's really important, that we discuss these issues and share notes on how best to identify and manage these risks.
All right, I will leave it there. Thank you, Director General, and I will leave it there, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Keneally. We'll go to Ms Hammond and then Dr Ali.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Director General. My question to you, I've got a couple of them. Do you think that there is a mature understanding of the difference between foreign interference and foreign influence across universities at the executive level, throughout universities more generally, and then across society?
Certainly, and I would suggest that the understanding of that at the executive level in universities has improved considerably over the last number of years because of the collaboration between government and that sector. But there's more understanding to be had there, as is equally, if not more so, I would suggest, across society.
Right, and across universities more broadly, universities being vast enterprises, so yeah.
Yes, I would suggest there is more work to be done, but we have made good progress, and we are making good progress.
So what further work could be done?
Firstly, continuing the messaging campaign of what it is. So every time I'm talking about threats from espionage and foreign interference, I'm explaining the nuance around what foreign interference is and what it isn't. Of course, when Home Affairs and my organisation reach out to universities, that same conversation is happening, and more broadly as it's being discussed with further, because it's not just something that hits the educational or research sector, it's just explaining that. The rest of that, I think you would have heard from Mr Till this morning in terms of the work that Home Affairs is leading in terms of continuing that education and, more importantly, helping the university and research institutions identify and manage these risks effectively themselves.
Yes. Can universities come to ASIO directly with queries?
Yes, they can, and we have engagement with them. But of course, we like to do it as a team government approach, so we're not stepping over each other. But they can come to us directly through our outreach program.
How many, say, over the last 2 years, how many universities have actually reached out? Would you know, or you might need to take that on notice?
I would have to take that question on notice.
Okay, thank you. What is the scale of the issue in your mind, in your opinion? What is the scale of the issue of foreign interference at universities?
Well, across the board, espionage and foreign interference is at a height that we have not seen since the height of the Cold War. It is a significant security risk that does need to be managed effectively by this country and the research and university sector. So it's a scale that concerns me.
And is the scale more heightened, for example, in the cyber area, or do you see that the scale across all the potential risk areas, is the scale greater in one than another?
No, it's a great question, and because that does matter. Cyber is, sometimes technically hard, but a far more effective medium to acquire information. So that's espionage, or acquiring information that actually can support knowing what student diasporas are up to, or knowing what might be said and being done on campuses. Of course, the human element has not gone away, but it has been constrained in this time because of COVID and reduced travel and no international travel. Yes.
Do you think that the current university settings and the emphasis and the need for universities, you make a couple of, that there's some excellent, I think paragraphs 15 and 16 of your formal submission really set out from where I sit the nub of the issue that we're trying to grapple with here. Do you think that the emphasis on world rankings and international partnerships and collaborations have increased the potential for risk?
It is potentially, well, it depends on who you're engaging with and the current geopolitical environment and where needs from nations lie. So, but I wouldn't want that to stop people from doing it, because I think, as I said in my statement, actually that's an important part, and we need that. We benefit greatly from that interaction with international students and international research organisations. I have an answer for you on your question about the number of universities. So last calendar year, 60 universities had engagements or reached out to ASIO.
Right. There's 40 universities in Australia, so I imagine that means
we have 60 interactions.
Yes, sorry. Yep.
No, thank you.
Okay. A number of other people who've spoken with us have indicated that over the last couple of years they've seen that sort of what may have been a naive or unaware approach from the university sector, say in 2016, 2017, has actually changed. Would you agree with that perception?
Sorry, could you repeat that so to see the context from it?
Yeah, sorry. A number of other people have spoken to us and put in submissions, have acknowledged or have commented that the level of awareness of universities about the risk has actually changed over from the period 2016-27 to today.
Oh, yes, I would agree, and change for the positive.
Right, okay. And that's, okay, one other thing on that. We have had a suggestion to us that it might be useful for there to be a national centralised agency or body that universities could go to. I mean, you've said you've had 60 queries come into ASIO. I imagine that other people would go to the AFP or Home Affairs. Do you think that there's some merit in having a coordinated body that universities could go to?
I would suggest, and far be it from me to suggest this, but the Counter Foreign Interference Coordinator in Home Affairs is the best person to get that central point of advice for. Of course, if students are threatened physically on campus, they should call their local state and territory police force. But beyond that, if students or universities in particular research organisations are looking for that central advice, I'd suggest there is already a mechanism for that. I'm not predisposed to create some new agency or body, but that's a matter for the committee and government.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Director General.
Thanks, Ms Hammond. Dr Ali.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Director General, for your submission and for appearing today. I want to kind of follow on from Ms Hammond's line of questioning about and something that you mentioned in your submission as well, about the specific context of the university sector and where the risks actually lie and the different kinds of ways to mitigate those different risks. And that's specifically around the idea that academics pursue knowledge, and universities' core business to a large extent is not just the pursuit of knowledge, but also the dissemination of that knowledge. And academics aren't just assessed on their research, but they're also assessed on the dissemination of that research. So, for example, if you want to go from an associate professor to a professor, you have to outline that you've had a number of publications, that you've used your research in teaching, PhD supervisions, and in conference proceedings. Okay? So do you see a risk in that activity, not so much in the collection of research or the research partnerships, but in the dissemination of research through conference proceedings, through teaching, through publications, and through all of those activities that form part of the core work of academics?
So generally, no, except for my point around if there is research or technologies that the government would consider that there's some sensitivity there. So defence is an example where that does happen. So more broadly, that purpose around clarity is for universities and research organisations from government, which, as I said, officials are working on what that looks like. There is a potential there that if our country deemed some form of research to be sensitive to our national interest, and that can be broader than national security, but if I just focus on national security, then maybe the dissemination of that research to the wrong area is actually a problem for us. But actually the starting point for that would be us being clear about what's sensitive and what's not. And I acknowledge there's some ambiguity there at this stage, which is unhelpful to researchers, students and research organisations.
Yes, you did mention that in your opening remarks, Director General. You said that there would be good to have some clarity around the kind of research that you're looking at here. Would it also be useful to have some clarity around the kind of dissemination activities? So, for example, it really is a kind of an academic geeky dream to have your work published in a prestigious academic journal. And for academics, it is the way in which they're assessed for promotion, and it's the way in which they're assessed as having expertise in their field. So there's a bit of what I'm getting to is this kind of tension, if you like, between the core activities of an academic researcher and how they're assessed by the university and by their peers, and the kind of national security interests in ensuring that the dissemination and those activities where you disseminate your information don't compromise national security interests. Is there a need, I guess is my question, for more clarity around that as well?
I think the clarity would come from if we're able to articulate what's sensitive and what's not, and if it's a place where that's a no-go for foreign involvement, then I suggest from that there would be a clear requirement to, subject to the right laws being in place or regulation, to actually not have that disseminated in a public sense. So I'd let the starting point come from the clarity of what's sensitive, what's not. I certainly understand how academics get measured, and I would not be suggesting that needs to change one iota.
So in your submission, you name a number of activities that you've observed. I wanted to ask you about the storage of data that's collected by academics. So, when you go through ethics approval, you have to sign off on how you're going to store the data that you've collected. Is there any, or have you observed any instances where data that has been collected has not been stored correctly and has been compromised?
I would...
as part of your activities here?
Sure. So in terms of the number of cyber intrusion activities that we are aware of, that would clearly indicate that it's not being stored, or that risk, cybersecurity risk, is not being managed appropriately because it has been taken. Now, if it's data that the university or the researchers don't mind that is publicly available, well, then that's not an issue. But if it's kept private for good reasons that you've outlined in terms of the process academics go through in terms of the storage of that data, and then it's taken from you, then I would suggest the security precautions are not adequate. But that's not a problem that actually is exclusive to the university or research sector. It's something that all sectors face in terms of how to properly protect data that's connected on computers that are ultimately connected to the internet.
Okay. Do you consider that the UFIT guidelines address many of the issues that you raise in your submission and that we're dealing with in this hearing?
I'm comfortable at this point in time where the guidelines are, but we know that is was a collaborative process, and one that we should continue to focus on, because it can't be set and forget, because the nature of the threat and how it comes at you and what they exploit changes all the time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Director General, and thank you, Chair. That's all from me.
Thanks, Dr. Ali. Mr. Wilson.
My apologies, Chair. I just had to turn off the mute. Thank you, Director General. My question was to follow on from one I asked earlier of representatives looking at the university sector and whether those foreign powers who seek to influence through our tertiary sector, whether you've identified as risks or issues have emerged a shift in their behaviour, either to cover their tracks and or to find alternative pathways to seek to influence through the through universities.
Yes, certainly. I will. My answer to that would be not just in this sector, where we collectively, the universities, research organisations and government, have taken actions. The foreign intelligence services or foreign agencies involved in seeking to influence or interfere, actually we've seen them pay attention to this, and we see them modify their tradecraft, as we refer to it, and it doesn't stop them, but it does cause them to pause and redirect their efforts, potentially through different means. So we are having an effect, but it's not a silver bullet, because their tradecraft will evolve.
So I take from that answer then that one of the challenges we face, and it's of course across the sector, your role, of course, the Parliament, but also the tertiary sector and research organisations, is the necessity for vigilance. And I don't mean that to sound, sort of trite or rhetorical, but a genuine need for an ongoing observation of the situation, because the tactics and the tradecraft continues to evolve.
That's correct. It's important here. This is a risk management exercise, so it's important that we continually assure ourselves, research institutions, universities assure themselves that they're identifying the right risks and those risks are being managed effectively. But that's the same in any other way you manage risks in any corporation or any sector.
No, I understand, and thank you for that. I'm just comparing. You mentioned before there's one country in particular that perhaps stands out or is most prominent in this space, but of course there are others. Are you identifying a consistent capacity to adapt tradecraft across all countries, or is it predominantly from, let's say, some or one country?
No, generally all countries are capable of understanding the environment in which they're operating and modifying their behaviours and tradecraft in response to measures that the collective element puts in place to harden the environment and manage that risk. So it's all countries that have foreign intelligence services are very effective at modifying their tradecraft depending on the environment in which they're operating.
Even though we identify there's one significant country, how many countries would you say, in a general parameters, I'm not asking for specific numbers, would you say is looking at tertiary research organisations and a mechanism potentially of foreign influence and or for the capacity to secure intellectual property and other resources? Is that sort of, because obviously not every country would have a sufficiently sophisticated intelligence system or intelligence services, and also they're looking in the direction of Australia. So we're talking none to 5, 10 to 20, up to 50.
I generally don't like giving numbers, but it's way more than one, but it's less than 10 in terms of countries we currently worry about, but that can change.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mr Wilson. Senator McAllister and then Senator Fawcett.
Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks for being here, Mr Burgess. I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question about the remarks that you were making earlier about better defining the kinds of technologies that are of interest from a national security perspective. That's helpful advice, thank you, and I think it is probably consistent with what participants in the sector will tell us also. The thing I wanted to ask you about it is just broadly, how would you categorise the kinds of things that you would be considering in establishing such a list?
Thank you, Senator. Probably not really for me to say in my current role, but it really is, as a nation, you would have to look at what technologies are important, technologies or research is important to you in terms of giving you the type of society and economic prosperity that you need, or giving you the capabilities that your defence department might need, or where you want to be the world leader in provision of certain things, and you kind of selfishly want to make our country the leader in that, and therefore that's a national interest, not just a national security perspective. Beyond that, I'm probably not going to be able to shed much more light on it, because it's something other than the need for clarity, which technologies are in, which are out, I don't spend much time on, but I know there are others who are well capable of doing that, have in fact done that, and are working through what that looks like.
I ask because I think we've got a long public policy history of clearly designating dual-use technologies that have potential military application as worthy of special protection and consideration, and I think that's quite straightforward. The issue that is now emerging is an issue that arises from questions about strategic economic competition with other nations and how we wish to position Australia in that context. That is a new kind of problem, and I wondered if from an intelligence perspective you had a view about the connection between economic ascendancy in particular domains and our security interests.
So it's an excellent point, Senator, and you're right. This is, and that's why I use the words national interest, which is broader than national security, at least where I sit, because you're right, the defence is a clear space, but more broadly, there are strategically other research or technical things that actually could be an economic interest given the environment in which we live, but generally in economic interest. Therefore, there needs to be a consideration of, is that something we need to protect? Not from everyone, but from certain people, for sure.
And it represents a departure from the way we've thought about economic and technology policy in the past. Our default settings for some decades have been towards openness. It's quite a significant change to assess that our economic interests are best served by protection. I'm not necessarily disputing it, but I make the observation that it is a departure from the past.
I would agree with you, and I would suggest, as you've highlighted, I think global circumstances are driving us in that direction, but that does not mean to say that we want to become totally protectionist as a nation. Obviously, that's not my lane, but that is something we have to be careful of.
Thanks, Mr Burgess. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Fawcett.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Mr Burgess. My line of questioning is largely the same as Senator McAllister's, but I'll perhaps just hone in on one point then. You mentioned that other people, Mr Burgess, are doing the work around deciding what are those critical areas of technology that serve our national interest. Are you able to tell the committee who is doing that, in your view?
Sure, and that was, I think, mentioned before by Home Affairs, but for completeness and maybe just to check our collective understandings, it's a combination of Department of Home Affairs and Prime Minister and Cabinet have the lead on that, but there is also the Department of Education, the Department of Industry, given by intelligence advice on critical technologies from the Office of National Intelligence. So there's a collective effort, but there's a couple of agencies that have primacy on moving that forward.
So given that ASIO leads the Counter Foreign Interference Task Force, and you've identified that one of the things that would make your job and universities' jobs easier would be to have a very clear articulation of what those areas are, do you have a view on whether there should be a standing body that not only completes the work that's currently underway, but is responsible for updating and acting as a reference point when new and emerging technologies or issues come along?
Senator, I think the way us officials currently identify and discuss these issues through the Secretary's Committee on National Security, I think that's sufficient personally. Of course, when it comes to the issue here of identifying critical research and technologies, I would acknowledge, as would my colleagues in that committee, that actually that list is not a set and forget, and there is a need to nurture and maintain and add and remove to that list because of that's the nature of advancements in research and technology.
If we take the evidence of the Home Affairs, though, which reflects some of the discussions post-COVID, that national security can be seen as a bit narrow, the security of the nation actually depends on the resilience of our health system, for example, and SCONS as a committee doesn't by default, and correct me if I'm wrong, include the Secretary of the Health Department as an example. Should we not have a group that consistently meets to look at the things that underpin the resilience of the nation, as well as the national interest topics that you've discussed?
So, Senator, you're right. SCONS has a defined permanent membership, but I can assure you that frequently many other members are co-opted by the Secretary of Prime Minister and Cabinet to be a part of that group to discuss issues such as this. So, again, not for me to judge, but I would suggest to you the way it currently works is sufficient to ensure there is progress on this issue and ensure the right issues are being identified and dealt with effectively.
Sure. And clearly you'll have limitations as to what content you can reveal, but could you inform the committee in your role leading the Counter Foreign Interference Task Force whether you are working with colleagues in other like-minded nations, US, Canada, UK, etc., on similar issues and bringing learnings back from them, as well as, my understanding is that we're often leading some of the thinking in these areas, obviously sharing our insights with them.
I can assure you, Senator, my agency and myself included are in regular conversation not only with my Five Eyes counterparts, but actually more broadly other allies who share same issues. And when I'm regularly having a video call with an agency counterpart, broader than the Five Eyes, they are very interested in what Australia's doing, and I'm very interested in their thinking and how they're approaching and dealing with this particular problem.
So the fact that other nations are actively engaged in this space Can I take it from that, to get this on the public record, that implies that our relationship, particularly with the Communist Party in China, is not just an issue for Australia, but that actions over the last number of years have caused concern in a range of open democratic nations?
Yeah, I won't. As I said, there are many countries involved in this. The conversation we're having is being had by many countries, and not just in the Five Eyes.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Fawcett. In the remaining time, I'll just ask a couple of follow-up questions. Mr Burgess, for completeness, I should ask you, given I asked Home Affairs also about the RMIT cybersecurity issues, whether you believe that can be attributed to a nation state at this stage. They told us that matter was still under investigation.
Sorry, referring to RMIT?
Yeah, RMIT University.
Yeah, I can't tell you what. I generally don't know who that is at this stage, because it's not reached my level. Not to say someone in my organisation is not working that problem.
Okay, thank you. On another matter, it was reported, I think it was a first by the ABC last year, that 2 Chinese academics had their visas cancelled, and it was attributed in part, the reason for the cancellation, an adverse assessment by ASIO or advice from ASIO. Are you able to confirm that is the case, that their visas were cancelled because of ASIO advice?
I wouldn't want to confirm that here, because you're asking me to speculate what's reported in the media.
Sure.
I can tell you that ASIO does do security assessments, including adverse security assessments, that does result in cancellation of visas.
Yep. And can you tell me on how many occasions a academic's visa was cancelled as a result of a adverse security assessment by ASIO?
I wouldn't want to say that in public.
Okay, fair enough. One of the themes of some of the submissions from the higher education sector is their belief that they are unable to conduct sufficient due diligence either on their research partners, other universities overseas, or their own researchers. And some of them say that they need to get greater assistance from ASIO or other security agencies to be able to do that. To what extent are you satisfied with that excuse from the sector, that it's too hard for them to do it? And to what extent does ASIO already assist them, and could you increase that assistance?
So I'd acknowledge that there are limits to what private organisations, such universities or research sectors, can do to background check either individuals or organisations. Having said that, we encourage them to do what they can lawfully, and we've helped them with providing them with what we call a due diligence tool that allows them to answer questions, ask questions, and get answers in a structured way. Of course, I'd recognise there is a remit for government and intelligence agencies such as myself in terms of what intelligence might tell you about either an individual or an organisation overseas, and that's not for them, and that's where we look to provide clarity. But I suggest there's more that they could do to seek information and ensure themselves the best they possibly lawfully could that they are making an informed decision. But I acknowledge they wouldn't have access to everything, and that's where the role that we and others would step in.
Yes, well, as I pointed out earlier, when Mr Joske was appearing, he's a private researcher and was previously at a small think tank, and he seems to be able to find more than some of our universities have been able to about their own researchers through open source research. And he said it's not a straightforward thing to do, but surely if he's able to find things, these multi-billion-dollar organisations could possibly find someone who can do a bit more due diligence.
I would agree with that, yes.
Would you agree also with the consensus of our submissions and evidence so far that there really is a diversity of responses and preparedness among the sector in dealing with these issues? There are some who are far more advanced dealing with it than others?
I think it's fair to say there's a varying degree, but in the major ones, I think there is good progress through those that have engaged in collaboratively with Home Affairs on how we identify and manage this risk.
Yeah, and that has come through clearly in the submissions and the evidence so far. Of those that haven't made as much progress, what are the policy options available to government in your view that that the committee could consider? I'm not asking you to express a preference for any one of those, but what are the range of options we could consider that would help those universities that are lagging behind catch up to their peers who are doing better on these issues?
To be honest, Senator, I have not given that much thought. Obviously, it's incumbent on any organisation that's accountable for the organisation to make sure they're identifying and manage risks. And I'd suggest that in this environment, there's plenty out there that tells you there's a problem and you know who to go talk to. You can talk to some of the universities that have had troubles in this space and are actually doing well in gripping it up and managing it. So they could talk to other universities, or they could go to Home Affairs. They should probably avail themselves of that. In terms of what policy instruments government could apply to the problem, I don't really have any value to add in that space, other than I think we can help with the clarity that I've talked about earlier.
Fair enough. That is reasonable. Colleagues, if there are not any further questions for ASIO, then I propose to thank Mr Burgess and release him for now, noting that there's likely to be further follow-up questions from the committee in writing, and we might also see if we can find an opportunity to hear from you in an in-camera session where we can delve into some of these issues in more detail.
Yep.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr Burgess. We will have a short break now and we'll resume with our next witness. I propose, given I recognise that they're in the room, that we start a little bit early with them, given we're finishing a little bit early here. Why don't we resume at 2:40 with our next witness, which is Human Rights Watch.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We'll now resume, and I welcome representatives of the Human Rights Watch, including its Australian Director, Ms Pearson, to give evidence. For the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Yeah, my name is Elaine Pearson. I'm the Australia Director of Human Rights Watch.
And Sophie McNeil, the Australia Researcher for Human Rights Watch.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that the hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false and misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. Evidence given today will be recorded in Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. As you know, in this instance, the committee is not seeking opening statements to be read orally, but to be provided in a tabled form and circulated to the committee. And we'll proceed directly to asking questions. Ms Pearson, I'll start and with you. The committee's invited you to appear before this committee effectively in two respects. One, because of your role at Human Rights Watch and the excellent submission that you provide to the committee, but also because of the experience that you've had at the University of New South Wales as an academic. And it was in part because of that experience that the government moved to refer this inquiry to the committee. So it'd be very helpful for the committee to understand from your perspective how that issue was handled by the university and what remaining concerns you have about it.
Sure, I'm very happy to start there. And I guess, yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to talk about the UNSW incident, but also to talk separately, more broadly, about Human Rights Watch's work on this area, because this is an area where we've been doing work, you know, since 2015, and we do have ongoing research on this area. But with regard to UNSW, so I am also, in addition to my work at Human Rights Watch, I'm an adjunct lecturer in law at UNSW. Last July, I was contacted by UNSW's media team for an interview on Hong Kong. I gave my views about Hong Kong's national security law and why it fails to meet international standards. I also talked about the need for a UN Special Envoy on Hong Kong, which is a recommendation that was made, indeed, I think, by one of the senators on this committee, Senator Fawcett, in a letter to the UN Secretary General. I didn't think that my remarks were particularly controversial. The university posted the article on a Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, I started to get text messages saying that the article had been removed. And then when I tried to access the article myself, I saw that I couldn't access it anymore. So subsequently, I believe 2 tweets that referred to my comments about Hong Kong were deleted from UNSW's account. The article then reappeared on the university website, but in a less prominent position on the law page as opposed to on the general UNSW media page. Subsequent to that, you know, this all happened largely because there was, you know, a huge backlash from pro-CCP students and others basically flooding UNSW's media accounts. And I think it probably took the university, you know, by surprise, off guard. They didn't know what was going on, so they reacted. But it continued to escalate. And the Global Times, which is the pro-CCP mouthpiece in English, wrote an article about it and repeated some of the claims by the Chinese students that were calling for me to be sacked from the university, for the students to boycott the university as a result. To be perfectly honest, I was a bit disappointed with UNSW's response. I felt like initially they just tried to distance themselves from my views by saying those are the views of an academic, not the views of the university. Subsequently, after I wrote an op-ed about it in the Sydney Morning Herald, the Vice-Chancellor did reaffirm the university's commitment to free speech and apologised for how the incident was handled. And I really appreciated that apology. However, I subsequently wrote to the Vice-Chancellor because I was a bit disappointed that, you know, there was no reference to China and the specifics of this incident, and that initial apology, initially it only went to staff. It did not go to students. And subsequently emerged that actually a very different type of apology was sent in Chinese by a Deputy Vice-Chancellor to the Chinese recruitment agencies. So, you know, that, I guess, in a nutshell, is what occurred.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning the different responses from different parts of the university to the incident, because I was going to follow up and ask about that. It appears, in addition to the apology provided to you for what happened, an apology was provided to Chinese students for what happened. Why should an Australian university apologise to any of its students for something an academic has said?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I mean, I think one of the things that made me a bit disappointed was I felt that, if this kind of incident happened at UNSW, I thought, well, at least the one thing that'll come out of it is that this will be a good moment to lay down, what academic freedom means. And it means, yes, you're free to disagree with your lecturer about Hong Kong or Xinjiang or Tibet, but you're not free to demand that that person loses their job over this and I think that's where there was a real failure to follow up, and there were very different messages being sent in Chinese to one cohort and in English to the staff.
Well, that appears to be a pretty cynical way of handling the issue to the university, to communicate different messages in different languages, perhaps on the assumption that it wouldn't be noticed, or it would be kind of noticed in a different way by different audiences. Having been through this experience, how confident are you that it would never happen again to an academic at your university or at other Australian universities?
Well, I think this is certainly not a problem that is unique to UNSW. I mean, similar sorts of problems we have documented at, many university campuses across Australia. And I don't see any clear sign that this wouldn't happen again, because there's been no sort of clear message, and there's been no repercussions for the people also who, led that social media campaign. And, that was one area where I hoped that there would be some kind of follow-up, some kind of investigation into the campaign of online harassment and intimidation. And I'm not really talking about myself here, because a lot of it was really directed at the university, but also at other students who actually also voiced, support for Hong Kong's democracy, and then themselves were threatened with being reported to the embassy.
And I will come to that more broadly on your submission and the work that you and Ms McNeil have been doing in that respect. But just a little bit further on this question, what do you think it is that's driving universities to be so sensitive to this criticism and to respond in such a way that really appears to violate their own values of academic freedom and free speech? What is driving this?
Well, I mean, education is Australia's fourth largest export. It's, there is a huge reliance now on international students for revenue from these universities. And, most of those students, a lot of them come from China. I think something like a quarter of all international students in higher education are Chinese. And so, I think that, in part is driving this. You have Chinese government entities wanting to cooperate and, offering to sort of throw money around to universities for research partnerships and fellowships and new centres and institutions. And I think because universities have been, so strapped for cash, they have wanted to take advantage of these opportunities. They also, are accepting large numbers of students from China, and that's not, a bad thing. It's great that we're accepting lots of international students, but we really want those students to have the same protections that Australian students also have.
Yeah, well said, and that's a really good segue to your submission and what I understand is kind of an ongoing work that you'll be doing and research you'll be doing about the unique perspective you bring to this debate, the human rights lens that you bring to this debate. So tell us about what your human rights concerns are, and particularly on behalf of students on campus and the experience that they have.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess firstly I just want to say that we see the protection of academic freedom as really a very integral part of protecting Australia's national security. And we feel like the threats to academic freedom really do threaten the safety of staff, the safety of students, their well-being. And this also goes to the real sort of integrity of our academic institutions. So we think that as part of this inquiry, and we have heard, we sat in on some of the sessions this morning, there's quite rightly been a strong focus on problematic research partnerships, but also focusing on these threats to academic freedom is really a core aspect of protecting national security. And I think, one other thing I've noticed today that there has been, a reluctance from some of our government departments and also a reluctance from some of our universities to use the C word. And, by that, of course, I mean China. And I don't think, for us, we're not going to beat around the bush here. It is one government that, is behaving in this way and that is orchestrating a lot of these threats and intimidation faced by students from China. And so Human Rights Watch has done this work. We've developed a code of conduct that we released in March of last year based on more than 100 interviews across Australia, the United States, Canada, the UK, and France. And so, these other countries are also dealing with these problems. And these problems are things like censorship, self-censorship, harassment, intimidation. My colleague, Sophie McNeil, has been leading the research that we have ongoing in this area, and she can probably speak, in a bit more detail to some of those findings and recommendations from that ongoing work.
Thank you. But please, Ms McNeil, if you could.
Sure. So since what happened to my colleague Ms Pearson last year, we began a project because we wanted to find out how many instances like this are still occurring. There was a peak in 2019 at the height of pro-Hong Kong democracy protests in Australia, where we saw some confrontations on campus, and we wanted to know, was this a one-off, or how many more instances are there happening like this? And we've done more than 50 interviews speaking to students from Hong Kong, mainland China, and academics of China, and who teach PRC students and Hong Kong students. And what we've found is that a large majority of students we interviewed who suffered harassment and intimidation did not report this to the universities. And when we asked them why they didn't report these instances, they said that they didn't feel that the universities could do anything, or that they didn't care. They expressed a lot of anxiety. They didn't know where to turn. They felt very lonely, very unsupported. So what we feel is that in all of these submissions and a lot of what we've heard today, the voice of these students really isn't at the heart of it. We feel they're very vulnerable, we also think that the students who are engaging in harassment and intimidation of their fellow classmates, they also are victims here and are vulnerable to exploitation from the Communist Party. We feel that some of the media coverage has portrayed them as these kind of, unthinking CCP flag, wavers. But the thing is, they've grown up in a very authoritarian country. They haven't been exposed to a lot of different opinions, and they come here, and in many ways they still live under party rule. A lot of their communications are on WeChat, things are censored. There was a very deep fear of being watched, of being reported on. All these very young people who said their greatest fear was their parents being visited back in China because of something that they said or did or participated in while they were in Australia. And while that didn't happen to a huge number of people, we verified at least 4 cases where that did happen. So of course, when that happens, it goes along the grapevine. Everyone is really worried about that happening. And a lot of the students we interviewed expressed quite a lot of surprise that they'd come all the way here to only still feel that they lived in a system similar to what they were living in under the CCP in China.
Yeah, and that's very troubling on a number of levels, Ms McNeil. That they felt that their universities were uncaring is deeply disturbing and doesn't reflect very well on them. But you also make a really good point, I think, about the fact that there'll be many students who are participating in this kind of surveillance of their fellow students who do so out of fear of the consequences if they didn't. I mean, they are victims of coercion and intimidation as well of the Chinese Communist Party. Can you tell us some stories, highlight some kind of individual experiences, obviously in an anonymised way, but what are the kind of instances of coercion or intimidation that you have talked to students about that they've told you about?
So, for example, a student who goes to a pro-Hong Kong democracy protest and then receives a message in their Facebook inbox, I saw you there because I was on the counter side. I'm going to report you, to the consulate. A student who's sitting in a Zoom class, because of COVID, and has a Hong Kong independence flag behind them, and someone slides into their DMs, I saw that flag, I'm going to report you. An academic at a university in Victoria just a few months ago who heard of a student who was harassed by a fellow classmate because he said he was from Taiwan, and the classmate said, well, no, Taiwan's not a country. And that message was accidentally sent to the whole class, not just the individual. And when the tutor wrote an email advising all students in that course that this kind of behaviour was unacceptable, she was then doxed. So when you're doxed, this is when your personal information is shared online. So her name, her email, her phone number went out on WeChat, and she had colleagues in China contact her and tell her that they'd seen what had happened, what was going around on the internet, and her personal details had to be removed from the university website as a result of this. So there's a whole range of experiences, but the deep feeling there is fear. What I think is surprising out of our research is the level of self-censorship. These instances of harassment and intimidation we've seen a bit in the news, but what we haven't really heard about is how there are so many students who come here and they say, I never speak out in class. I don't say anything. You know, I can't talk. I can't freely express myself. And a lot of them mention how they felt like this began right from when they were first kind of recruited to go to the particular Australian university that they chose. So back in China, you are invited to join a WeChat group, you know, with the agent who helps you organise your travel and your university and all of this. And so you are part of this WeChat group with all the other fellow PRC students who might be doing the same the same course at that particular Australian university. So that feeling of being watched beginning at that stage, and then it constantly being used, you know. And one thing that came out of the research was this isn't just happening in the humanities, you know, when politics is discussed, or history, or China studies. That the doxing of the academic that happened during an engineering class. So, you know, there are students who are commerce students, but if they say something about Hong Kong in their WeChat while they're here in China, they can still be doxed or threatened with being reported on. We also interviewed more than 25 academics who talked about how much they struggle to just talk about China these days in universities. You know, that fear of being recorded by their students, doxed if they say something controversial about Hong Kong or Xinjiang, and that could risk perhaps family back home in China if they're of Chinese background, or it could endanger their ability to travel to China for the future, and people who've spent their whole lives devoted to studying this country and learning the language. So that's just some of the trends that we've picked up.
Yeah, I can say from experience, it's not a ill-placed fear. The Chinese government does ban people from travelling to China if they're critical of the Chinese Communist Party. It's particularly unfortunate to hear that these students feel that coming to Australia and studying in Australia hasn't achieved what they thought it would for them, that they might as well just be studying back home in China. I mean, there's presumably one of the reasons why they choose to come here is that they hope to have a different experience to what they could have had back in China. So that is very sad. What can we as a committee do? What can the government usefully do to assist here? And separately, what can universities do to assist?
So I think we heard this morning a lot about how Australia has been leading in some of these areas of research partnerships and perhaps picking up on concerns around 1,000 Talents program. But what we've found is that other countries in this area of, you know, upholding academic freedom and trying to safeguard the well-being and safety of students and scholars of and from China, that we are being left behind here in Australia. We've seen efforts in the United Kingdom and the US where universities have publicly spoken about these issues, you know, particularly after the passing of the national security legislation in Hong Kong. So their fears about how to protect their Hong Kong students or Chinese-speaking students, and they have done things like allow students to submit essays anonymously. They have tried to reduce the number of class discussions. When things are sensitive, they try and have one-on-one sessions. So these are things that are being done at Harvard, at Princeton. There are efforts by academics to develop a code of conduct around how to teach China in the US as well. So we have some recommendations that we think would work well here in Australia. One thing we really want to see is a sector-wide approach, because we know that, you know, universities have been concerned about being perceived to be, you know, standing up to China. And so we haven't seen them speak out strongly when these incidents happen. So we feel that if the sector responded and developed procedures, standard procedures for how universities respond when these cases come up, that would be much better. And then universities wouldn't be so fearful of being picked off or punished by my, you know, education agents if they're, you know, seen to stand up on some of these issues and push back.
Well said. Ms. Pearson, did you want to add something there? Yeah,
maybe
please.
Also, just to sort of add in on the government side, I mean, I think important work has been done by the Foreign Interference Task Force, particularly focusing on the problematic research partnerships angle, but less attention has been paid to issues around censorship, academic freedom, and so we would certainly encourage that group to closely look at these issues and perhaps to consider, you know, or I don't know if it's Department of Home Affairs or the Foreign Interference Task Force, but to compile an annual report that documents the number of these incidents, how they've been handled by individual universities, because we feel like that data is really missing.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'll go next to Dr. Ali and then Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms Pearson and Ms McNeil, for appearing today. I just have two questions, and the first question with regards to the extent of the research that you've done, Ms McNeil, and whether you looked at also other education institutions that feed into universities. So, for example, English language schools, and whether there is any activity at those English language schools where they teach IELTS and do university prep courses, for example.
We did document one instance of a student who was at an English college in Queensland who was harassed and intimidated, and he didn't feel comfortable reporting it to his institution, didn't know where to turn, and when he went to the local police, they told him he couldn't help. They couldn't help him, and that's actually a common pattern that we saw. So the majority of students who had harassment and intimidation happened to them, and 40% of those who said they didn't report it to their university or English college, a couple who went to the police, none of them were kind of successful in their complaints. They were all told that they couldn't be helped, and one student also called ASIO and was also told that he couldn't be helped and wasn't offered any support. So we think there needs to be an education campaign actually for students to know where to go. As one student commented to me, look, I know what to do if I'm sexually harassed, but I didn't know I could talk to anyone about these issues. So they really feel like they don't know where to go sometimes, I think.
Where could they go? Could they go to HERIOC, for example?
To who, sorry?
Human Rights Commission.
To Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission?
Again, one of the students went to the commission and was told that because they were an international student, they couldn't be helped. So this is one of our, some of our recommendations is that there could be a position within TEQSA, the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency, some kind of ombudsperson who deals with these complaints anonymously and would also report annually on the trends that they are seeing and the number of incidents. We feel that this is a real gap that students are falling through. And, we heard ASIO say that they deal with the covert operations. A lot of this isn't covert. And so it isn't for ASIO to investigate, but the university as well hasn't been paying enough attention to it or letting students know that they can also, that they should be reporting these incidents to them. So they really are falling through the cracks at the moment and have nowhere to go or turn to sometimes with these concerns.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you a question about the balance between protection and academic freedom. And you alluded to this in your previous answer to the chair. And in your submission, you speak about how at Oxford University, they're allowing some students specialising in the study of China to submit papers anonymously. They're replacing group tutorials with one-on-one. In the code of conduct that you present, there are parts of the code of conduct are about offering flexibility for scholars and students working in China, and protecting them. Where's the balance though between protecting and therefore kind of having, I guess, some kind of self-censorship and censorship around the kinds of activities or the ways in which academics teach, and the point that the chair made about people coming here for an academic experience, which in Australia is all about open and free discourse and the development of critical thinking and standing up for being able to speak openly about issues where people may disagree. Where's the balance there? And in protecting, are we actually also stifling that academic freedom?
I mean, maybe I'll jump in and then Sophie, feel free to add. But, I think there's definitely no one size fits all. Like, I think the risks that are posed to students studying, certain courses where there may need to be full anonymity or, the possibility of submitting work under a pseudonym, that may apply to students who are studying, in the political sciences, courses specifically dealing with China. However, our research has also noticed, a lot of these problems around tutorials occur, across the board, things like engineering, business, finance, and so on. And so I think, it's really about at the beginning of each course, a university lecturer is also laying down the law and saying, what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate, and that it's not okay to threaten, your fellow classmates with being reported to the embassy because they make, some comment that you don't agree with.
Yeah, and we have seen some best practice by some individual tutors, in particular universities where they have really firmly laid down the line and they haven't had these incidents occur. They have allowed students to submit essays anonymously or conduct their private kind of presentation. That those things are happening at an individual level, but we really think there needs to be a university-wide approach. And one thing I think that's important to point out is that this isn't just, paranoia on behalf of these students. We've seen more than 50 Chinese citizens go to jail in the past 3 years for things they've said on Twitter. There was a student at the University of Minnesota who was jailed in January 2020. So he had been studying in the US, posted some things on Twitter about Xi Jinping. When he returned to China in January 2020, he was sentenced to 6 months jail for the things he wrote on Twitter when he was studying in the US. We interviewed one young man who opened a Twitter account when he became a student in Australia, posted some pro-Hong Kong democracy comments. His parents back in the mainland were visited. He was threatened through them not to say anything else. And now he feels like he will never be able to go back because he knows about these other people's experience who've gone to jail. So these are very real fears. And the level of anxiety that we saw in these young students was just incredibly high. The loneliness, a lot of the Hong Konger students I interviewed said that a lot of people they knew were on medication, were seeing psychologists because they were feeling such levels of fear and anxiety. And that's actually one thing we think is important for universities to understand that hasn't been discussed enough is the extraterritorial nature of the Hong Kong national security law. So if Hong Kong students who have more than 8,000 in Australia, by the most recent numbers, I'm unsure how they've been affected by COVID, how many have been stuck here or had to go home. But those students, for comments they make in Australia, they can be jailed once they return home. And there has been discussion in the US and the UK amongst academics about these issues. We haven't seen that discussion here by our universities. We know that some academics have tried to raise it with their schools, and there hasn't been the inclination to want to follow that up and to come up with a university-wide policy of how they're going to handle this law that really does affect their own students and their own academics. Sorry, you
I'm on mute. Why do you believe that is? Why do you believe there is this reticence?
Oh, look, I think that if you are seen to speak out on these issues or, stand up to that Chinese government attempt to influence academic freedom, then, universities can be attacked, just like we saw happen with Elaine and UNSW. There is definitely blowback when you engage on these topics, which is why we want to see leadership from, the sector representative bodies, from Universities Australia, from the Group of 8, because I think it is difficult for individual universities sometimes to respond on these issues. So if there's very strong standards that are adopted across the sector, then I think that's the best way that these issues are going to be dealt with.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. That's all from me.
Thanks, Dr. Ali. Senator Fawcett.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you for your evidence. 2 questions for you. You mentioned at the start how you were focusing on the Chinese Communist Party. We had evidence from earlier witnesses that in areas of foreign interference and espionage, we see actors that are non-state actors, organised crime, other authoritarian states in particular, working in those areas, things like cyber attacks, etc. In this area of student harassment, threatening, etc. on campuses, have you got any evidence of other state actors treating their nationals in a similar manner?
No, frankly, we haven't. Our research has been pretty limited to looking at the experiences of Chinese students. That said, we've done a lot of work at Human Rights Watch focusing on abuses faced by diaspora communities. We've reported on threats, to the Vietnamese, Cambodians, Rwandans, Ethiopians in Australia. So those, threats are really there. But when it comes to universities, a lot of these students are coming from China. And while, I think, yes, absolutely. Look, if you had a protest on West Papua at a university, no doubt the Indonesian government would be calling and asking for that to be cancelled. But you don't see universities caving to the demands of those other governments in the way that they do cave to the demands of the Chinese government. I mean, you had the Dalai Lama event moved off Sydney University's campus to be held somewhere else. And I think that really is because of this dependence on the revenue from students from these countries. And so that is an issue, I think that is quite unique and distinct about this particular government.
Sure. To a practical issue, you've mentioned that a number of the students you interviewed felt that they couldn't go to the university, or the police couldn't help them, or ASIO couldn't help them, the Human Rights Commissioner couldn't help them. If the guidelines were changed such that each of those bodies said, yes, we can help a foreign student, other than reporting, and so collecting a database of evidence, what could they do? What should they be doing? What should our society, government more broadly be doing to support students who come here to study in our institutions, to avert the kind of behaviours by other actors that impact both on students but as importantly on our academics in terms of self-censorship and the actions that university administrations take?
Well, some of our recommendations involve universities, first of all, starting to have this conversation and speak about it. We've seen a real reluctance to speak about it. One of the submissions argued that these one-off instances, don't pose any kind of systematic threat, but we believe that they do, and we think that university system needs to speak out loudly and clearly when these incidents happen, to clearly draw a line and say what is acceptable, what isn't, and to actually explain and refer to the details of who's made the threat. We often, when these incidents happen, they don't say the government that did the threat. Again, the China word is not used, so we want some really blunt, plain talking so that these incidents are called out for what they are. We want universities to define doxing, so that's circulating of private information online, to clearly define that and to define the act of reporting on your fellow students or academics, as a serious violation of the Student Code of Conduct, and that it's grounds for disciplinary action. So there's not much discussion on campus around these issues and the fact that if you did do this, it could lead to serious repercussions. So we think that laying down a line would deter some of these students. At the moment, there's no deterrence because universities also haven't been investigating them. So when students have engaged in these incidents like what happened to Elaine at UNSW, we haven't received any information from UNSW, and we asked about an investigation and if the students who, had their names and profiles on their social media accounts when they made these attacks and threatening comments, were these students followed up with in any way? We weren't given that information, so that at the moment there's not enough deterrence to stop that behaviour. We also feel that offering the ability to submit work anonymously and developing those standard procedures across schools, across universities, will help students who feel that they want to participate and can't. I mean, obviously, a university in Australia can't stop someone's parents in China being visited. There are certain limits there, but we can make sure that these young people don't feel so lost and so alone, and that they feel supported when they're here. And that the universities can work with them to find ways to express themselves. And there are instances of best practice that is happening, but again, there's just no sector-wide approach, and it's very one-off. There's no standard code here at the moment.
My final line of questioning goes to other nations that have experienced similar things. You've mentioned the United States a couple of times. Do you have any evidence or collaboration through Human Rights Watch with European universities who have had similar incidents occur to their students?
Well, in the United Kingdom, they've got they're working on a model code of conduct for the protection of academic freedom, and that has been an initiative of academics who've come together to do that. And at the moment, they're consulting with stakeholders across the higher education sector in the UK. And this again came out of concerns about teaching China. So that was where their conversation started. But we don't have any formal relationships with European universities. It's mainly been the United States actually, where there has been specific codes adopted at certain universities who teach China studies and have a lot of PRC students. And we've also actually seen in the US the closing of Confucius Institutes. Just last Friday, they introduced new legislation under the Biden administration about the funding of universities who have Confucius Institutes on their campus. So the US has really been leading in terms of these issues of harassment, intimidation and self-censorship, much more than we've seen in any other country.
Sure. Could I perhaps ask you to take on notice that if through your networks you do have any reporting of similar actions by government, similar issues on universities with students, that you could come back to the committee with that?
Yes, absolutely. We'd be happy to.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Fawcett. Ms Hammond.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you both for presenting today and for your submission. It's a really fascinating topic. It's a really disturbing topic too, talking about the levels of anxiety of students. And I'm going to follow up, I think, on what Dr. Ali and Senator Fawcett, but probably go off on a slightly different tack. What about the levels of anxiety? In your capacity at Human Rights Watch, so the level of anxiety of international students, particularly those being impacted by the Chinese Communist Party, levels of anxiety in students more generally and fear of speaking out on other topics. Have you done any research work on that?
We concentrate on human rights abuses at Human Rights Watch, so we haven't been generally surveying Australian students. So no, you'd have to, ask a different NGO about that.
So, so that concept of, freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is a human right. Have you looked at freedom of speech and suppression, or people being afraid of speaking freely on any other topic at universities, and the social media maelstrom that can happen if you speak out?
No, we have not really looked at that issue. I mean, we've looked a bit at the French model code, which deals with free speech, and we have had, some conversations about that code. I mean, we feel like that code really does deal with the experiences that, Australian students may face, but where the model code really fails to address these issues about the needs of international students who are more worried about, the threats of what might happen to family members back home if they speak out. But we haven't really looked at those issues because I think we did feel like they're quite adequately covered by the French code.
Yeah, it's interesting. And sorry, I was just trying to get a greater context for this because I think that a lot of research would show that the level of anxiety and feeling of loss across the university sector, across many students, is higher than it's ever been. And so it was just context, and not in any way trying to diminish the significance of this particular issue, but just trying to put it in that context. I'm curious as to whether you had done any research on it.
Sure. No, and I think that the thing with these fears is it's not kind of just a general anxiety, it's that I will go to jail in China, or that my parents will lose their jobs or go to jail, or I can never return to China, or I can never return to Hong Kong. So it really is, the highest level of anxiety that you could experience, I think, as a young person. There really are quite extreme scenarios that these students worry about and could realistically face too.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to diminish that, but I think levels of anxiety, we get into tricky grounds there. I think that the levels of anxiety, somebody can feel a heightened level of anxiety that they're going to be socially ostracised, so, and again, I'm not attacking the work that you're doing or the contribution, and I think that the submission that you've made is extremely powerful. I was just trying to get a context about this. So I might just leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Ms Hammond. Just a final question from me in the remaining time that we have. Ms McNeil, you mentioned Confucius Institutes and the actions that the United States government is taking to remove them from university campuses, which is mirrored around the world, and a lot of other countries have taken similar action. How concerned are you about Confucius Institutes and the role they play on campus, and how concerned should the committee be about them?
Well, Human Rights Watch doesn't believe that Australian universities should have these institutes on campus. We feel that they are fundamentally incompatible with a robust commitment to academic freedom, and they are extensions of the Chinese government. They do censor certain topics and perspectives in courses based on political grounds. We had an incident in 2018 where Victoria University cancelled the screening of a film. Someone from the Confucius Institute there heard about this film, which was pro-Falun Gong film, or it was critical of the CCP in some manner, and a colleague said this could be an issue for us, and it was discussed behind the scenes apparently, and then the screening of that film was cancelled, and that's one example that we know about, but we do not believe that institutes like that should have a place on Australian university campuses.
Yeah, I think if the Chinese government wants to fund those centres, off campuses, then, that's fine. But, I certainly think that Australian universities should be offering Chinese language instruction, not through the Confucius Institute. So, maybe the solution is to ensure that, there is proper and adequate funding for language. And I think that's going to be an even greater need as we see these security challenges posed by the Chinese government.
Yes, and I assume you would have an objection to, any foreign authoritarian government funding what are academic courses or quasi-academic courses on Australian university campuses, regardless of where it comes from.
Yes, absolutely.
And we saw your point about academic freedom is well made, given what we've learned about the University of Queensland's Confucius Institute. The university itself has admitted that the agreement that it negotiated with Hanban, the parent body for Confucius Institutes, had inadequate protections for the university's autonomy and academic freedom. And it's good that they've realised that now, but why was it ever agreed to in the first place without those sort of protections in place?
Yeah, I think there's been, a real lack of transparency around, the budgets of Confucius Institutes, how they operate. We've had to rely on journalists sort of FOIing, the terms of these agreements. And I think just the very presence of having these institutes on campuses, it makes, students from China who are not, who are questioning things about the government, it just makes them feel very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I imagine your concern extends to courses, undergraduate courses being directly funded by the Chinese government or other foreign authoritarian governments. That is also a revelation out of the University of Queensland, where 4 courses were funded by the Chinese government directly. I believe one of them was a human rights focused subject.
Yes, we would absolutely have concerns about that.
Our understanding is that the University of Queensland has changed those arrangements, and we welcome that.
Yeah, I do too. All right, well, thank you very much for that evidence and your submission to the committee. It's been very helpful. It's possible that the committee members will have further follow-up questions in writing, and we really welcome your assistance in that. And I know we'll be following with interest your forthcoming future work in this space.
Yeah, we would love to, perhaps make some additional recommendations in writing to the committee if that would be appropriate.
That would be very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, colleagues, I propose that we proceed to our next witness ahead of time, since he's here and available in the room.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I now welcome Mr Drew Pavlou to give evidence. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Drew Pavlou. I'm a human rights activist from Brisbane, Australia, studying at the University of Queensland.
Thank you, Mr Pavlou. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that the hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. In this instance, the committee asked that any opening statements be written and tabled rather than read out. Have you provided an opening statement to the committee?
I've not submitted it, so I could maybe table that later.
Yeah, thank you. And look, there's no need, it really is up to you. We will proceed directly with questioning because we are familiar with not just your submission, but your experience. And as I said to Ms Pearson before her appearance, it's in no small part because of your experience that we're even having this inquiry in the first place. So without taking us through the full gory history of that long saga, can you just tell us what is it about the experience that you had as a student at UQ that troubles you the most and that should be of concern and focus to the committee?
I think the most troubling part about my experience was the kind of stifling effect it has had on free speech at our universities, especially when it comes to these sensitive topics such as human rights in Hong Kong, human rights in East Turkestan regarding the Uyghurs. Because I think there are so many students at the University of Queensland and other universities, and just in my own personal experience, speaking with other students, so many students who, were supportive of the protests, and this even extends to students from mainland China as well, who I was approached by them on campus multiple times. I was told, we really support what you're doing, we really support your protests for democracy, but we can't be seen even standing or talking to you, because the Chinese Student Scholar Association monitors and keeps tabs on the politics of all Chinese students. And just when it comes to, say, domestic students, there were many domestic students who, again, in my own anecdotal experience, supported the protests, told me such, but said to my face, I'm not going to be protesting alongside you because I don't want to lose a job, I don't want to have my career destroyed. I want a job with the university one day, so I have to watch what I say, that sort of thing. And as well, you have students, and I think this was touched on by the recent witnesses for Human Rights Watch. We have students with family in mainland China, and these students are very, very vulnerable. And there are multiple instances where students' families have been visited and threatened by Chinese state security members as a consequence of protesting either at the University of Queensland or other universities across Australia. So there's a huge problem when it comes to stifling free speech in this country. I think the fact that no one at the University of Queensland has ever been held account for what happened to me shows that they're almost, they see themselves above the law, they act with impunity. They believe that they don't have to follow the laws of this country. That was my experience at the University of Queensland with how the Vice-Chancellor and the Chancellor and the university administrations more broadly treated me with the investigation they begun into me opened on spurious grounds, and this investigation against me launched for political purposes. There are huge, huge problems with procedural irregularities, procedural fairness, my right to a fair trial at the University of Queensland when I was accused of these matters. There's a huge problem, I think. I think we're seeing a chilling effect across Australia for students. So many cases where students with family members in China, they cannot speak because they feel that the Chinese Communist Party can reach them even here. And students from Australia who feel that they can't speak about these issues on Australian campuses, oftentimes actually because of what I experienced, being assaulted on campus and basically being dragged through the mud for 2 years by my university, subjected to basically kangaroo court trials, the subject of fake charges. I've got my lawyer, Tony Morris QC, here today, and one thing he noted during the UQ proceedings against me was that at least some of the charges that they levelled against me were fabricated. The university had said that students had complained about my conduct, and then the students in question ultimately came forward and said, "We have never complained about Drew Pavlou. He's a friend of ours. We don't want the university to be doing this to him." And so what that shows is that the university was basically just trawling through all my social media, trawling for things to go after me with. These were fabricated charges. There was an investigation in search of a crime, and students across Australia see that and they wonder, is it really worth it to speak out? You know, we've got a regime that has 3 million Muslims in concentration camps, and apparently we're not able to discuss this without fear in Australia. Students on university campuses cannot discuss this reality without fear that the university will go after them, that their employment will one day be threatened, that they may be subject to the same kinds of things I was subject to, being named by the being named by a spokesperson by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, being named and attacked in Chinese state media, which encouraged my expulsion, and possibly, facing violent attacks, which I suffered multiple times. It wasn't just July 24, 2019, that first rally where I was assaulted. There were times on campus, months after that, when I was campaigning in student elections, and I was physically accosted, assaulted. When I was elected to the UQ Senate, Chinese students ripped down the Hong Kong Lenin Wall on campus and put up a photo of me that said, "This is what happens when you insult Chinese." There's a whole pattern and there's a whole range of intimidation going on here, and there's a huge chilling effect, because for most people they just think, would I want to go through this? And the answer is just no.
Yeah.
And so it's easier to just silence yourself.
So, Ms. Pavlou, you might have seen recently that the former Vice-Chancellor at the University of Queensland, Professor Hoy, who's gone to a new job at the University of Adelaide, gave an interview to the Australian newspaper, which was covered prominently on the front page, about how he's learned so much from his experience at UQ and is kind of a convert to the dangers posed by China's Communist Party interference in our universities, and that he'll bring this new experience and wisdom with him to Adelaide, to the University of Adelaide. Given that obviously he's taken some time out to reflect on that, has he or any other representative from the university ever contacted you to apologise or offer any explanation for why you were treated the way you were?
Never once. I'm really glad that the Vice-Chancellor Peter Hoy was able to learn so much from that experience, the experience being dragging me through the mud for 2 years, basically bringing in 2 international law firms, possibly spending upwards of, we're talking millions of dollars possibly in Australian taxpayer funds, because they hired in 2 international law firms, Clayton Utz and Minter Ellison, that are high-tier law firms. They had partners at these law firms. And they used these law firms to go after me. So I'm very, very glad that Vice-Chancellor Peter Hoy has been able to learn so much from that experience. Unfortunately, that had to come at my expense. And to this day, not a single person has ever apologised to me from the University of Queensland. I have made statements to the effect... I've made previous statements, and I would repeat it here, that if I were to get a full unreserved apology and an admission that I was targeted for political purposes and this was wrong, then I would drop my $3.5 million Supreme Court action that very second, because it's not about the money for me. I just basically want justice. But no, never once been contacted. In fact, the new Vice-Chancellor, Deborah Terry, took the time out of her busy schedule to write to the Intelligence Committee to say that I had basically lied to the Intelligence Committee in my submissions. Well, I'm more than happy, and I'm testifying under oath right now, I'm more than happy for people to go through that with a fine-tooth comb, because everything I've ever stated about my experience with the University of Queensland, I've just been repeating my direct experiences.
You mentioned the investigation into you and the fact that 2 top-tier law firms were hired to assist the university with that investigation. And we don't yet know how much money that the university spent on that, which is derived from student fees and taxpayers. But I look forward to hearing from the university about that. To your knowledge, what efforts did the university undertake to engage in investigation of the students who appeared to assault you at that rally? I've seen the videos from that rally. It's pretty clear that you were assaulted and that the people are visible in it. I don't know how easy it would be to identify them, but how many law firms did they hire to pursue those students? What efforts did they make to track those students down, and how successful have they been?
To my knowledge, they never contracted in any law firms. So let's just look at the discrepancy between how the University of Queensland treated me and how the University of Queensland treated men who came onto campus, possibly were not students. They were there with the sole intention of shutting down a peaceful protest with violence and physically assaulted multiple people, in fact, even biting a security guard. How did the University of Queensland respond to that violence on campus? Well, it was related to me by the UQ Union president at the time, Georgia Milroy. She related to me that Deputy Vice-Chancellor Joanne Wright suggested that there be a multicultural barbecue held to kind of lessen the tensions on campus. So I'm not sure if the men in the skeleton teeth mask who assaulted me, punched me in the back of the head while my back was turned, bit a security guard. I don't know whether they would be invited to the multicultural barbecue. I guess that's up for grabs. The University of Queensland started an investigation into me that Freedom of Information records have shown that just over a 3-month period produced over 15,000 pages worth of documents on me. That's a 3-month period. Now, my first protest was July 24, 2019, so it's now been almost 2 years. I truly wonder what the true number of pages worth of documents on me exist in the University of Queensland. It would have to be tens of thousands, because if in just 3 months they could produce 15,000 pages worth of documents on me, then that shows just how intense this level of surveillance against me was, just how intense their campaign against me was. Now, UQ was never able to identify any of the men who assaulted me. They didn't report them to the police. They didn't really make any inquiries. My understanding is they circulated pictures of them around the faculties, and after months of investigating, they've never once been identified. Later, Queensland Police, after the Honourable Bob Katter MP made representations in Parliament, they charged one man who assaulted me, who had assaulted me by punching me in the back of the head while my back was turned on the day, a coward punch. They charged him, but he had already gone back to mainland China, my understanding, very soon after the protests. They were not able to tell me whether he was a student, and they would not tell me his name because apparently that was all confidential proceedings. But they did. Thank God, they did let me know that if he ever were to come back to Australia, he'd be arrested at the airport. I'm not sure Mr. Skeleton Teeth Mask is really planning any Australian holidays soon, because it seems that he was there, very likely, in my belief, at the direction of Chinese consular officials, and he was there with the intention of sowing violence.
Yeah, you mentioned consular officials. The Chinese Communist Party's Consul General in Brisbane has been historically an honorary professor at the university. Following these events at campus, he's made a series of public statements encouraging and congratulating Chinese students for standing up for China on campus. The comments were so inappropriate that the Foreign Minister publicly rebuked him, which is a highly unusual thing to do. What action did the university take against him?
And it's also my understanding that the United States Ambassador to Australia also condemned those comments because they were very highly irregular. He was congratulating the self-motivated patriotism of the Chinese students who assaulted me on that day. You look at the level of violence that occurred that day. There were security guards bitten. There were Hong Konger girls who had their dresses ripped. There were Hong Kongers who were choke slammed to the ground. I was punched in the back of the head while my back was turned, coward punched. I was punched in the ribs. I was thrown to the ground. Other Australians were assaulted. And he was congratulating the Chinese students on their self-motivated patriotism against the separatists my understanding is that separatism is a capital offence in China that merits the death penalty. And after he made those statements, I received dozens of death threats, hundreds of abusive messages across all my social media accounts. Abusive messages that threatened to kill me, threatened to hire hitmen on the dark web to kill me, murder my family, rape my mother in front of me, and then murder us both. Vile comments. And it's my understanding that as we speak right now, it's been almost 2 years since that first day. Consul General Zhu Jie is still an honorary professor at the University of Queensland, which is quite something, because the only person who has ever been subject to disciplinary action at the University of Queensland in relation to any of the violence that occurred at that protest was me. And I was the person who was assaulted.
It is fairly remarkable that someone who has the status of an honorary professor at the university who openly incited violence against university students has not been reprimanded by the university in any way and remains in that position.
I would like to quickly note, I believe Chancellor Peter Varghese, after about 11 months of pressure and being questioned by journalists for 11 months, he was willing to make the admission that, the comments where he actually endorsed violence against our students may be a little bit bad. So that was a really brave intervention by Chancellor Peter Varghese, which I really am very thankful for. Yes.
Mr. Pavlov, I'm not sure Hansard will record your sarcasm, so let me note it for the record.
Yes.
I could go on for some time, no doubt, but I will refer to some of my other colleagues first to see if they have questions. I know Mr. Wilson has some questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Pavlov. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Pavlov, for appearing before us today. I actually have one very simple question based on your evidence so far, which raises serious questions about the university and their conduct. In your opinion, was the University of Queensland compromised, corrupt, or cowards?
Yes, I believe that I was targeted. I was targeted for political reasons, and I was targeted for political reasons because they wanted to protect their economic relationship with China. In the case of Vice Chancellor Peter Hui, he was receiving a $200,000 bonus every single year on top of his $1 million salary, and this bonus was directly tied to deepening relationships with China. And so I believe that Vice Chancellor Peter Hui directed this entire investigation into me, this entire process to try and expel me, to muddy my name. I mean, they went to the media. There was even a spokesperson for the University of Queensland who went to the Australian Financial Review and mocked my sex life. I mean, it's just, apparently calling me a virgin. It's just the absolutely most remarkable campaign by an Australian public institution against an undergraduate student. And why did they go so vicious? Why did they wage such a vicious campaign against an undergraduate student? Was it because, as they would like us all to believe, I used a pen in a campus art shop and I took some notes with that pen and I put it back on the shelf without paying for the $2 pen? That was a serious level 3 charge that Minter Ellison partner Tom Fletcher argued before the UQ Kangaroo Court that I should be expelled for. They want the public to believe that I was targeted and disciplined for, such spurious offences such as this. And I don't believe for a second, I don't think anyone with any common sense would believe for a second, that a university like UQ would spend millions against an undergraduate student simply because they used a campus art shop pen without paying for the pen, put it back on the shelf. I mean, this was so transparent. This is the really frustrating part for me. At the very least, it must be moral corruption. But who knows how deep it goes into. We don't know necessarily about the economic ties, the personal economic investments Peter Hui, Peter Varghese may have had. But at the very least, it was moral corruption. And it is so transparent and it is so obvious what they did here. And yet they've all been rewarded. And the only person who's been punished, whose life was almost destroyed, was mine. Peter Hui has been appointed to the University of Adelaide as the new Vice-Chancellor for 5 years. That's a contract worth millions. He's been rewarded for what he did to me. Chancellor Peter Varghese, a new 5-year contract worth millions. He's been rewarded for what he did to me. Sally Pitkin, the UQ Senate member who chaired the Senate appeals body that upheld the expulsion, She was awarded an AO on Australia Day and received Australia Day honours. And for me, it's just shocking that, you know, the three people most responsible for what happened to me, Peter Hoy, Peter Varghese, Sally Pitkin, throw in Zhu Jie as well, all of them have been rewarded. You know, Zhu Jie is still an honorary professor. It really sickens me because, you know, the Premier of Queensland still, you know, fates Zhu Jie. They've had celebratory dinners with Zhu Jie. They had a huge, like, celebration of the People's Republic of China Foundation, the 70th anniversary. They had a huge celebration and he was the guest of honour that night. And that was 4 months after he encouraged violent assaults against me and basically gave a green light to death threats that basically destroyed my family life for 11 months, for up to, like, you know, almost up to a year. My relationship with my family was under so much strain and under so much pressure because of the death threats that were levelled against me. And those death threats came because Consul General Zhu Jie endorsed them. And the Premier of Queensland was hosting him at a celebratory dinner. He was the guest of honour. And it's not just Labor, it's not just one side of politics. You know, you had Liberal members as well in Queensland, LNP members, congratulating him. It's just shocking. All these people who did so much to make my life hell over basically a 2-year period. I'm 21 years old. I was not a professional activist. I was never remotely prepared for any of this. It was thrust upon me. That first protest where I was assaulted and the death threats that followed, I had to just keep going because to have silenced myself would have been to allow, like, you know, forces of terror to gain victory. They wanted to try and use terror tactics against me to silence me. And if I had silenced myself, if I'd chosen silence, they would have won. Now, I was not prepared whatsoever for this. It has caused so much strain to my life. 2 years on, still, all the people responsible have all been rewarded. They've never once apologised. They refused to even... We actually had a conciliation conference recently with the Queensland Human Rights Commission. And their first offer to me, to try have me drop the Supreme Court proceedings was, "Oh, Drew, why don't you just admit you were wrong and we can all move on from this?" This was the University of Queensland's offer to me to drop my Supreme Court lawsuit, and that was 2 months ago. I mean, still to this day, there's no admission of guilt. They still continue to muddy my name. They go, Drew was expelled because he had carried out serious offences against other students. This is the University of Queensland's official position. And it muddies my name. It defames me. I've never, you know, I was a good student. I received awards from UQ for my academic work. I did volunteer tutoring for refugee students. I raised $5,000 to provide 250 free hampers to students at UQ when COVID was hitting and students were going hungry. I've got this record of good community work. I was a good student, never once in trouble. It's quite interesting to me, like, you know, they try and make out that I was this sort of like demon from hell student, like this sort of Ferris Bueller style rat bag. My academic record shows that the only, you know, engagement I had with the University of Queensland, other than my studies, was just, you know, receiving awards for my academic conduct. Never once had any disciplinary problems, was never once in any sort of trouble until I held one protest, July 24, 2019, which happened to threaten the university's $300 million ties with China that are worth billions in the long term. And, you know, to Peter Hoy, were worth $200,000 to his back pocket every single year, which I guess, you know, is a nice new Tesla.
Chair, my one question is given sufficient answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I do have further questions, which I'm happy to proceed with, but I just want to make sure that other committee members don't before I do, because I don't want to take on anyone else's time. In that case, Mr. Pavlou, The university has maintained all through this saga that the allegations against you were not political and never related to your activism. Now, I've seen the first set of charges that were made against you, and the university subsequently dropped a number of those.
9 out of 11.
9 out of 11, there you go, because they didn't stand up to scrutiny and frankly were pretty embarrassing.
Within their own kangaroo courts, they had to drop 9 out of 11 charges against me.
And in reviewing those original charges, I mean, some of them were literally laughable, including allegations that you used bad language on social media, as if you were the only undergraduate student at the University of Queensland guilty of that offence.
50,000 students at the University of Queensland. If the University of Queensland had put millions of dollars into a campaign against any student at the University of Queensland, they probably could have done what they did to me. Because when you have 50,000 students at the University of Queensland and you have a student charter that is written in very broad terms, it would be violated thousands of times every day. So really, they could have done whatever they could have done what they did to me to any student, but I guess what's the difference? Well, they don't want to spend millions of dollars on just some random undergraduate student. They spend the $1 million trying to go after the guy who calls into question the university's $300 million ties with China, because there's a genocide going on and because there are 3 million Muslims in concentration camps where they're subject to rape, torture, beatings and bashings.
It seemed to me, looking at the full list of allegations, that perhaps they had a small number of initial allegations and didn't feel that that was sufficiently serious or wouldn't achieve their objectives, and then they went around looking for other things that you could did to add to the rap sheet. I mean, Mr. Morris, your lawyer, could probably talk about how prosecutors have had a habit of doing that in the past as well to achieve their objective. Is there any other explanation as to why such trivial things were included on that initial list of allegations other than malice?
Well, I guess maybe the University of Queensland and Vice-Chancellor Peter Hoy were really worried about pen theft. So worried perhaps that they were willing to spend millions of dollars over over a pen worth $2.50 in the campus stationery shop. That is the level, that is the ridiculous reasoning they're expecting us to accept right now.
And the two charges against you that were upheld, that resulted in your suspension from the university for 6 months, what were those final two charges?
I believe one was related to an online biff I had gotten into with some other students. And I mean, how many online biffs are there at the University of Queensland every single day? Like, you could do this against any student, honestly, if you wanted to. And the other one was a satirical prank I did where I wore a hazmat suit to the Vice-Chancellor's office in protest at the fact that they weren't shutting down the university in sufficient time when it was the start of the COVID outbreak and there were students being infected on campus. And my belief is just that they deliberately dropped all charges related to China, because if you look at the initial charges they held up against me, many of them related to my protests, many of them related to my criticism of the Chinese government, including one charge that there was one charge that the University of Queensland levelled against me that I had encouraged Chinese students that I'd forced Chinese students to withdraw from their courses because I had made a post saying, as the democratically elected UQ senator, I support democracy in Hong Kong. And UQ was saying I had caused a student from mainland China to withdraw from their courses for that. So, these were charges that were directly related to my campus activism.
Yes, and just on that one, if any student did withdraw from the university, if that even is true, as a result of your post, I'd be surprised if that student was able to meet the admission standards of the university, given that I would hope most prospective students would understand that a 21-year-old, or in that time 20-year-old student politician does not, in fact, speak for the whole university.
Yes, it was very laughable. And my legal representative, Tony Morris QC, he tried to find more information about that specific allegation. He tried to look into whether this person even existed, and the University of Queensland was never able to provide any evidence that this person even existed. Because, at the end of the day, we know that they manufactured some charges against me because there were charges in there that said that I'd bullied particular students, and then those particular students came forward to the public and media and to UQ and said, we never once complained about Drew. He's our mate. We had basically banter. He shouldn't have. This is wrong. What's happening? So we know that we already know they manufactured some charges against me. The question is, how many were manufactured? That's the problem. Like, this was such a transparently corrupt exercise of university power, of authoritarian power over one undergraduate student. And not a single person has ever once been held accountable to it. In fact, the main ringleaders, Peter Varghese and Peter Hoy, have these new 5-year $1 million contracts. They've been rewarded for what they did to me. I guess, you know, I think honestly they were rewarded for what they did to me, because I think I think the university sector more broadly understood the threat that my protests posed to the relationship with China economically. And so I think it's kind of just like, you know, mates helping mates. Peter Hoy, you know, had this huge backlash against him, Peter Varghese, big backlash against him, but they get these 5-year new contracts because, you know, the boys help out the boys.
Ms Pavlou, that's been very helpful and a very powerful testimony for the committee. I'll provide my colleagues a final opportunity if they have any further questions for Mr Pavlou to ask them now. But if not, I'll thank you very much for making yourself available for the committee, coming down today to testify before the committee, and we greatly appreciate your assistance.
Thank you, Senator Patterson. Thank you to the committee members.
Okay, there being no further questions, then I declare this public hearing closed.